Now we're going to have our second panel, and I'll introduce our moderator. And again, gratitude to our moderators today, Karen, Betty Sue Hertz, and Jackie Francis. Betty Sue Hertz is a contemporary arts curator, lecturer, and writer working in the intersection of critical visual culture, and socially relevant issues. She was director of visual arts, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, 2008 through 15, curator at the San Diego Art Museum, and director Longwood Arts Project. Hertz is currently project curator at the Magneti Shrem Museum of Art Davis, and public consultant for the new design of Lian Mountain Park in Suzhou, China. She has taught modern contemporary art courses at Stanford, San Francisco Art Institute, and here at California College of the Arts. So thank you, Betty Sue. And Betty Sue is going to just introduce our panelists as we come up, our two panelists.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this very important event here at CCA. And I am very pleased to be here, and I look forward to hearing this panel with Gilda Posada and Angela Berry. I want to first start with bios of these speakers and then briefly introduce the session. Gilda Posada is a cultural worker from Southeast Los Angeles, California. She received her AB from UC Davis in Chicano Studies and Comparative Literature. Her interdisciplinary practices are rooted in working with, from, and by the Chicano community. Hilda's projects are invested in decolonial practices that challenge patriarchal, heteronormative, oppressive structures. She's an active member of the artist collector Espacio Tercero, and her work has been exhibited nationally, most notably at the 6th Chicana Biennial. She's been featured in publications such as Art Practical and Third Woman Press Anthology. Angela Berry is an artist, curator, and writer whose work investigates the mysterious material and cultural production of landscape. She is the 2014 to 2017 recipient of the Bernard Osher Foundation Scholarship at CCA. Angela earned a BA in Art and Art History from Sewanee, the University of the South. Between 2008 and 2015, she worked actively in New Orleans at the Contemporary Art Center as an educator and visual arts coordinator, at the Front Art Collective as a co-director, and for the Roving National Conference Hand in Glove as a co-organizer. Her art and curatorial collaborations have been reviewed in Art Forum, Art in America, and Art Papers. Wow. It's already so impressive, and you haven't even graduated yet. You guys are awesome. So indeed, you guys have given me a really tough job of putting together two very different presentations. But let me try. Both presentations are certainly about what happens at a particular place. One, which is primarily a cultural place, and the other primarily a natural place, but so much embedded in the cultural scene that it is something of a bastard nature. Yet, in both presentations, we find that the viewer of the artwork under discussion is caught by surprise against expectations, which puts something into motion for the audience, and I'm not going to give it away what it is. I also want to point out the writing itself that you will hear today spoken, which is very much part of these presentations. So the presentations are both visual and literary, and I suggest that you listen for the nuances of the writing itself, the language that is used to describe these works, because it's very important to understanding where these speakers are coming from. And so let's start, and I believe that Gilda is going to be the first speaker.
Lowriding has been a form of social practice in the Chicanx community since before the Chicano movement. I am interested in the representation of lowrider aesthetics as produced in cars, which is where identity, pride, and culture becomes accessible to Chicanx communities across Aztlán. This representation, however, has not always been welcoming to all due to masculinity and heteronormative ideologies. I will analyze Manuel Paul Por Vida billboard mural, which I curated at Galería La Raza as Studio 24's fellow. In investigating Por Vida and the four occurrences of vandalism, along with the practices enacted by local lowriders and the gallery staff, myself included, I intend to queer lowrider aesthetics and reshift the discourse of what it means to be part of the Chicanx community. I will do this through the queering of Dylan Miner's concept of lowriding through Aztlán. Aztlán is the mystical Chicano homeland, a utopic idea for Chicanos as a detribalized indigenous nation. Miner presents lowriding as an intentional slowness that repositions between various temporalities. Lowriding through Aztlán engages pre-colonial indigeneities alongside colonial, modern, and contemporary Chicano responses to colonization. What I am proposing is to queer this concept and investigate it through a lens of fluidity that allows for intersectional experiences to come forward when considering Chicanos. Chicano is an identity in a never-ending formation. Decades of Chicanas and Chicanos have questioned its colonial and patriarchal roots. The decolonial transformation into using X's in the beginning and the end of the word is a result of current generations challenging colonial gender binaries, which exclude folks who are gender fluid, gender non-conforming, non-binary, or trans. A queer lowriding through Aztlán would thus embrace Chicanx, Chicanx being an identity which is always in process towards decolonization and deconstructing oppressive structures and histories. Through this lens, I propose that Maricon's Collective's Por Vida billboard and the steps taken by Galería La Raza upon vandalism opened up a decolonization process, one which put Chicanx into practice. Maricon Collective, founded in 2014 by Rudy Blue, Carlos Morales, Manuel Paul, and Michael Rodriguez, was a queer Chicana Latino DJ art and artist collective. In reclaiming the word maricon, a crude word for gay men used by cis men and women to insult gay men or to question the masculinity of straight men, the group sought to redefine the term to empower queer people of color. Paul's role was the lead visual artist. In a low and slow process, the queering through Aztlán began, with Paul's Por Vida, created to celebrate transgender life, especially in the Latino community. The mural offers a queer Chicanx lowrider aesthetic and falls in line with what Ben Chappelle calls a means of performing masculinity, which happens in lowrider cars when a subject is offered as the object of the gaze. Yet Paul does not present a sexualized woman at the center. Instead, it is a trans vato. Aesthetic choices like the roses reflecting each other as they are placed along the trans body creates a border around the vato, allowing him to be the focus of the viewer's attention. The scroll with words under him resembles how lowriders create messages to honor their subject. Lowriders do this to amplify their message. Here Paul writes, Por Vida, a term used by Chicanos when referring to a dedication of a lifestyle, in this case, both lowriding but also being queer and trans. The radiating lines that come out of all directions from the trans vato centralizes and frames him as the main image. The lines allude to the raised images of La Virgen, who is greatly replicated in lowrider art. Thus, the rays coming from the trans vato elevates him into a level of praise and sacredness. The trans vato is supported by two opposing images. On the left of the mural are two vatos. The vatos have goatees and wide rib tanks. One is laying his head upon the back of the other, and the radiating beams come out of the right side of the man, signifying a motion of embrace. On the right-hand side of the mural, two women are placed on top of a pink airbrush background, and they have pompadour hairstyles, dark lipstick, and Sharpie eyebrows. They gaze into each other's eyes while caressing each other's face. Again, the radiating beams come out of where the women are touching each other. The chains around the mural create a border. The only point which they do not meet are around the transvato, which can be read as a breaking of chains. The flowers on the bottom left and right of the mural are not yet in bloom, but when looking at the flowers that surround the transvato, one can see that the flowers have come into fruition. The blue behind the vatos and the pink behind the woman, the yellow behind the trans person, are used to speak to gender binaries and to pay tribute to the previous generations who have informed the change in a decolonial identity formation, that of Chicanx. After 2 days on display, the mural was defaced with blue and red spray paint, colors affiliated with gangs. SF, home to lowrider car clubs and movies like La Misión, is also home to many norteños and the debut to their opposing rivals, sureños. Thus, the message that was sent was that local gangs set aside their differences to stand in solidarity with each other against the mural. The trans vato, shirtless, has a teardrop tattoo on his left eye and wears a hairnet. He was left untouched, signifying that the community felt a connection with him. However, in slowing down, one can see that under his chest, those are not rose thorns. Instead, they are surgery scars. El Tecolote published an article pointing to this, and on the same night, the trans vato was tagged, an indication that they no longer felt a connection to him. The mural was reinstalled a third time and defaced that same night. Galeria ED reported the incident to SFPD. However, they said that because there were no direct threats to anyone in the space or graffiti with hate speech, they could not label it a hate crime. Social media conversations surfaced calling the mural an appropriation of lowrider culture. Yet news outlets reported that the mural was a gay cholo mural, which complicated the situation as it was describing protesters as angry stereotypical gang members. So what does this mean for queer Aztlán? As queer Chicanx were being targeted, many donated funds for a mural replacement and an installation of cameras. The mural was reinstalled, followed by a community vigil condemning the vandalism under camera surveillance. Through a queer and slow lens, we can see that the tactics towards defense were linked to colonial modes of surveillance and military. However, in the eyes of many, this would protect the visual manifestation of a queer Aztlán and trans and queer lives. Yet, community members fell in agreement that the mural should come down, invoking men to defend their manhood and culture. Comments suggested that it belonged in the Castro, indicating there was a place in SF for queer folks, just not the mission. One summer night, 2 individuals took to Bryant Street and set the mural on fire. SFPD responded to the scene, took the footage from the cameras, and left a police officer on duty for an entire week. During this time, local youths were coming to the gallery and standing outside in protest of the mural being reinstalled once again. This occurred for about 2 weeks, during which time SFPD declared the incident a double felony, including a charge of hate crime and arson. SFPD released video footage of 2 Latino men setting the mural on fire, an action which Galeria decided not to do. As soon as the footage was released, news outlets began pursuing the men responsible. Following the manhunt, SFPD started implementing gang injunctions on the youth standing across the street protesting. They frequented the Muni stop and would arrest 45 youths on a daily basis. Galeria had to make a decision whether to intervene or not. These youth might be amongst those who set the mural on fire and supported the act, along with making threats to the LGBTQIA folks. Yet they formed part of the Chicano community which Galeria claimed to engage and support. Upon staff consensus, Galeria made the choice not to press charges on the individuals who set the mural on fire. It became clear that the solution was not to keep engaging police, as they represented a larger structure of the prison industrial complex that has already damaged many of our families in our communities. It was here that Galeria took the steps towards Chicanx and decolonization, as it embraced engaging in a never-ending process of consciousness that would better serve its communities. In this awareness, Galeria reached out to local organizations who engage in restorative justice practices, such as HOMI, who works with youth on the streets to intervene their involvement with the juvenile justice system. In Chicanx, Galeria was aware that they had to keep pushing away colonial and oppressive structures that would in the long term affect the records of the youth It is why Galeria began opening its doors to the protesters to come inside the gallery and protest. In support, Bay Area groups who engage in decolonial and healing practices provided spaces for healing circles and limpias, ultimately resulting in a community forum at Mission City College where all parties were invited to join the conversation. At the event, Yolanda Lopez, a Chicana elder, took a stance in front of everyone and told Paul that the mural created an opening, and he became the spear that finally pierced a hole into what the Chicano movement was fighting for all these years, and what we thought had long been closed, indicating that Paul's mural had created a transformation and allowed for the boundaries of Chicano to be expanded into Chicanx. Although no one from the opposing viewpoint went to the community forum, the mural became a space where praxis occurred, and ultimately that is the stage which Chicanx is advocating to become. Chicanx is not an end, it is rather a way of life, a constant negotiation with oneself to open up and to keep making way for inclusion, instead of marginalizing and excluding others as we have done so for generations because of colonization. If we are to lowride our way through Aztlán, we have to be aware that although we carry roots to this land, it belongs to no singular person or experience. A queer lowriding through Aztlán allows for a collective ownership and accountability of us all. As Juan Fuentes said, we are a community por vida, and we have to reach a place to transform together, not against each other. Thank you.
Ronnie Horn notes, confused, lost, large expanses of water are like deserts. No landmarks, no differences to distinguish here from there. If you don't know where you are, can you know who you are? The more time you spend around this water, the more faint your memories of measure become. Footnote 40. Footnote 14. Your reflection uncouples in this water. It drifts away from you. As you stand there on the bank or bridge, helpless, watching your reflection float downstream and disappear, you may wonder what forces water gathers. But instinctively, you already know they must be closer to witchcraft than geometry. Footnote 15. Best witchcraft is geometry. Footnote 16. See poem number 1158 by Emily Dickinson. When you imagine images of a river, what do you see? Do you see the oxbow in the Connecticut after a thunderstorm as depicted by Thomas Cole? What about the Thames in London? Do you see Turner's view of the Waterloo Bridge or the House of Parliament through Monet's atmospheric pigment? Do you see moonlight or mercury? If I recall river, I recall those I've lived near, the Broad, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Sacramento, for example. In particular, I recall a set of rules protecting me from its wilderness. No touching, supervision required, no standing near the edge. Predictably, the rules of engagement amplified the allure, arousing desire for entry, for touch, and for intimacy. The dangerous, unpredictable, and varying conditions of a river demand awareness. Like the sharpening of a knife against a wet stone, looking at river water sharpens one's attention to the view. Critical information rests inside of minute details. How tight is the earth packed along the bank's edge? How wet is the stone? Is it a stick or a snake? How fast is the current? Where is the bottom? Regardless of where I am, when I stand in front of a river, two questions surface. What is in the water and where does it come from? The way rivers act on the mind has a history of producing metaphor. For example, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus used the metaphor of river water's variability to describe flux as a law of the universe. From a single volume of Heraclitus's translated fragments arose the well-used saying, "You can't step into the same river twice." Another example can be found in the work of contemporary American artist Ronnie Horn. Throughout a career of over 3 decades, Horn has investigated the confluence of geology, identity, and place through the subject matter of water, focusing significantly on London's major urban river, the Thames. Between 1998 and 2000, Horn produced 800 written meditations on the Thames and paired these musings with photographs made of the water surface. In this slide, we can see Horn's large format cameras rigged to scaffolding aboard a tugboat inside the river, which produced a suite of images of this dramatically turbulent surface, paradoxically capturing the moving water as a motionless surface. Horn likens water to a master verb, an act of perpetual relation. In this presentation, I consider how Horn reconstructs the landscape view as a dynamic active subject rather than a passive object, through her verbing of the River Thames in the body of work Still Water, the River Thames, for example. By irregularly deploying the exacting systems of photography, language, and perspective, I argue that Horn has converted these tools of reason to river logic. As a result, landscape does not become a symbolic form. It remains a stage where projection yields to the indeterminacy of an unquantifiable subject. Still Water consists of a suite of 15 footnoted offset photolithographs. The footnote system, written and compiled by Horn, rests in the paper's bottom white margins, which is right here. The superscript numbers appended to the notations at the foot of the plate are matched to digits that are placed intermittently on the paper surface over the river, which we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Horn has created a reciprocal coordinate system, empowering every point with contradictory content. Unable to express ideals, they elevate difference. Still Water offers a DIY map, permitting the viewer to create value and meaning through the associative logic of still or dry water. The adjective wet is the description of something covered by water or saturated with liquid. In this definition, when something becomes wet, it shows a character of yielding, which could be translated to mean a lack of forcefulness, submissiveness, or even weakness. In this translation, to become fluid could mean the dilution of strength. However, I propose that becoming fluid is a strengthening, a wetting. To wet is the act of sharpening a tool or a knife. It's an act of stimulation. In this proposed application of the metaphor to Horn's work, I consider how the fluidity of Horn's subject matter, water, language, and perspective, are used to reconstruct the landscape view as an active narrative agent. The effect of verbing a landscape destabilizes what we think we know when we can recall river. And the wetting of a different awareness produces a different type of knowledge. From afar, the minute text and superscript in Still Water obscures recognition. Intimacy with the work is required for any chance of entrance. Paradoxically, intimacy with the work off-centers the viewer. Herein lies the strategy through which Horn's created a vertigo of meaning. The closer one is to the work, the further you are away from organizing the triangulation of visual systems and the metaphoric content inside of Horn's prose. As Horn implies through her invocation of vertigo, being off-center inside the Western codes of aesthetics and writing is destabilizing. When a photograph is oriented horizontally, typically the composition leads the eye to a point in the distance, evoking the heavens. When text is read from left to right in the Western tradition of linguistics, the reader goes from point A to point B, or from capital to period. The intent of these knowledge systems is to construct coherent reason from meaning. Horn's removal of recessed space formally deconstructs distance. This strategic maneuver challenges one of the most powerful inferences of perspective in the history of Western art, the God's eye view, which is on display in Albrecht Dürer's Artist Drawing a Nude with Perspective device. This work illustrates the regime of perspectival construction that Horn's work refuses. In this image, we see the illustration of a perspective machine attempting to organize a view of the female nude. The male painter signifies the advancement of culture, order, and geometry. The nude stands for nature, disorder, and asymmetry. Here, woman is both matter and material, a symbolic form. This image celebrates the control of the subject, as culture has conquered nature. Historically, the genre of landscape in Western art imaged nature to stage political and religious narratives. For example, canonical works like Cabanel's Birth of Venus depict landscape as an unyielding backdrop to the ideological narrative expressed by the figures in the foreground. Holding this in mind, let's reconsider Horn's yielding or verbing of the landscape view. For Horn, water is not a amenable muse, and nature is not a noun or its modifying adjective. Therefore, it cannot be a nurturing mother, a pristine woman, or a positive teacher. It's not a stage servicing the ideological authority of the foreground. Horn is refusing the normalizing conventions of the lens, the word, and the view. Still water offers us a perspective that represents a communion presupposed by corruption, mythology, literature, history, geography, psychology, and politics. Horn calls this experience of water a type of a priori communion. Origins are contested in her mythology. Man never fell from grace. Instead, he seeps up through the disgusting aquifer of an urban river and watches his reflection float downstream. Horn states, footnote 7, "This is a turgid moment, a moment of bemusement." Horn inverts Durr's perspective device. Culture yields to the river's system of logic. As a result, the viewer unmasters the view, becoming performers in an uncertain visual field. The water organizes the viewer, whose body is contorted, as opposed to the subjects, and finally, without distance, the Thames absorbs our projections. The permission that Horn affords her viewer recalls Andy Warhol's Do-It-Yourself series. Comprised of 5 large press-type works on canvas, Do-It-Yourself arrives to the viewer half Warhol, half template. The unpainted areas of the canvas are outlined and contain superscripted digits that correspond to an inaccessible palette. In Do-It-Yourself sailboats, we see a deep blue background with pink clouds, and the foreground is largely incomplete. The incompletion of the instructions enlists the viewer to co-author the work. The annihilation of distance in Horn's landscape views creates geographic imaginaries between the artist, the viewer, and the space of representation. In still water, the narrative exists inside of a footnote system that is cited by the water, inverting the hierarchy of perspective between human and land. Water cites us. In return, our sight is sharpened or whetted against an alternative system of visual, linguistic, and spatial perspective. Water is indifferent to our projections. Water brings the distance near. As you read Horn's view, the water cites Horn, and Horn cites you. Horn is drawing imaginary angles to the water by affixing numeric points to alight the viewer's gaze. This strategy is a way to make the eye wander, just as if the viewer was a pedestrian trafficking the river, watching the water move in their mind. Horn reroutes our attention to unconsolidated fragments, narrative contradictions, and an imaginative geometry that unquantifies the landscape view. In still water, we are given an aerial perspective looking down at the river. When we look down, we miss our reflection, but make amends with the echo of Horn's language. Her use of redundancy overwrites departure from the frame and affirms our arrival. We are given the columnar cradles of rhetorical interruption. We are descending rather than transcending the kingdom on earth. The kingdom is simply here. There is nothing on the horizon, no stage for monolithic projections of power. The field of view is that afforded to a pigeon, a horse, or a fish. The heaven Horn's work gives us is a falling away from reason, a falling into place, the ability to find the freedom beneath our feet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for your presentations, and thank you all for sticking with us today. And I just wanted to say a few words, and then I will ask you both some questions, but they're more just to be out there, and you can respond to them, and then we can open up the floor to the audience to ask questions. So as I indicated earlier, there are some tough visual and textual challenges in the works that are the subject of these presentations. And I'm just going to focus my questions on each one. To retroactively call lowrider culture, this is for you to think about, social practice. What does that do for framing a practice that emerges from local community histories rather than from a high art or contemporary art context? So that's one question. I'm not going to ask you to, I'm going to kind of ask them all at once. You can pick which one you want to answer. How does class impact the responses, as in vandalism, of queer versions of lowrider aesthetics? Are these works primarily aesthetic or pedagogical? There are different registers of performativity in the presentation that you gave. There's the performativity of Galleria de la Raza, yourself as the curator. There's the performativity of the artists who create the work, the Malacon group. There's the performativity of the work itself. And there's the performativity of the kind of creative act, even if it's destructive, of the vandals. And then there's the performativity of the police who come and are brought into the situation. And then there's the performativity of the community who decides to make some decisions in terms of dialogue and maybe a kind of reconciliation. So maybe you can think about or respond to some of that, and then we'll maybe go to you, because it's a lot to remember.
Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in the larger scope of my thesis, I proposed that social practice is actually, it comes from the Chicano community, but also Black movements stemming from civil rights movements, right, that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, and continued. I mean, we know that Black movement started in late 50s, actually. And I feel like Western European constructions of social practice have definitely left out these narratives in terms of how these communities organize through art and using them to activate, to intervene, to protest, and to make change, right? And that's kind of what I'm framing lowriding as through this talk. I'm not saying alternative strain anymore, because I feel like it's social practice. To me, to us, right, if we look at what lowriding is, they go community to community using their cars, they use their interactions, right? They use the performance of the spectacle and having car shows and bringing in communities, and you know, from different generations as well. And it's often not considered contemporary, conceptual, high art for that matter, just because they happen in parks, they happen at cookouts, they happen in Chicano Park, wherever it is that they're happening. We're not going to these places, right? We're not writing about these places. These places have been in existence since the late 60s, early 70s, and yet they're just considered nonprofit cultural spaces. So in reframing in this talk, I really wanted to showcase this as a social practice, because it has influenced a whole generation, right? Communities who are often marginalized, not spoken about, or even considered to be part of art, right? I used Claire Bishop's book as like the first social practice book that was written. You know, she travels the world finding different projects, yet she presents it at SF MoMA, and there is no mention of the mission, right? There's no mention of these projects. So, you know, as a scholar, I'm really trying to frame these practices as that. And I mean, the performance, you know, I really think social practice kind of jumps on performance and what was happening in the 80s and how the audience became part of the actual experience and bodies. And Claire Bishop writes a lot more about this, and I'm probably butchering her writing, but really, this is what Galeria was doing, right? They're responding. They work with police because they think that's what's right, but then interventions happen, and you have to really consider different communities, which is what social practice, like a successful project in my view, you're open to readjusting, right? You're open to changing your practices because it's not just about you as a single author. It's about, right, the community, and at some point it no longer becomes your project, right? Like at some point it was beyond Manuel Paul's hands, and it wasn't just his decision to say take down the mural or put the mural back up. It was actually people giving money for the mural to be put back up. So I hope that touches on a little.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you. So Angela, I have a couple of questions for you as well. So thank you so much. I find that your approach is both so literary, and I'm not surprised that you would select this work. I was just curious how you came about finding this particular work, which seems to be so appropriate for your sort of sensibility and what your interests are. So that's one thing. I was also interested in this one thing that you said about how the river water sharpens one's attention to the view. And I was curious about reflection, about the sort of more traditional idea of water and reflection, and moving water and journey and reflection, and how that kind of works into this, both this work and also your thoughts about the work itself. And I guess my last question is about this idea of surfaces and depth, and that the river has been such a kind of metaphor beyond the artwork. Certainly there's many poems and novels that have the river as a sort of central character, and how you see this particular artwork as making the river a protagonist in relationship to these kind of stories. How does that sort of play out in the way you're thinking about this?
Thank you. It's interesting because when I came into visual and critical studies, I was not writing specifically about, I was writing about photography and text and the relationship between image and word, but through public land surveys, and specifically the 19th century land surveys that were commissioned by the U.S. War Department to, like in particular, the 40th Parallel Survey, which was the Great American Desert. So I came into the program with this idea of really tackling how the landscape art canon sort of integrated these early photographs that were produced for a land survey commissioned by the U.S. War Department, and then sort of made their way into the art canon, and then you still see this way of constructing a landscape view in a very different cultural sphere. So I've always been thinking about how those landscape images in particular lend themselves to a lot of different types of applications. So looking at the original context in which they were produced when photography was invented was my first year and a half in the visual and critical studies program. And specifically there was the eyewitness was the photographer, and Timothy O'Sullivan, I had a slide of his work in my presentation. There was a geologist who was the examiner, who was Clarence King, a 19th century geologist, and then there was the commissioner, which was the U.S. War Department. So I was doing all of this writing about these images, what the relationship was to their titling, and then I saw Ronnie Horn's land survey on the River Thames, which was commissioned by the Public Arts Development Trust in London. And I guess after a year and a half of being in the Library of Congress land sort of portal, it was sort of this beautiful response to a lot of the conversations I was constructing criticism around. And then here was an eyewitness and examiner report sort of infused through the lens of art and literature that really just sort of blew open and had a response for that initial research. So that's how I found Ronnie Horn's work, which is not the normal sort of portal, right, to Horn. But it's such an interesting land survey. And then your second question about the reflection and the surface and the depth. Well, I think it's interesting because I think there is actually a footnote in the 600 footnotes in this body of work that says I'm not going to talk about the river as a mirror. And there's a lot of different sort of references to what is it, and I think I guess the paradox is that it's a mirror that doesn't reflect your own image. In fact, even if it does, it's fragmented and it floats away. And it's this, humbling moment in which you see yourself, but not through yourself. And as a part of my research this past year, I had the amazing opportunity, with the support of the department and CCA and Ronnie Horn's water library in Iceland, to go to Iceland and live in her library for several weeks and do research. Iceland's been a very important part of her practice, and she's been going for over 30 years, and she made this water library after the River Thames work in 2009. And when I was there, I was on an island that was smaller than Kentucky, and there's 130 active volcanoes in Iceland. And it occurred to me that this conversation of the surface of the paper and the surface of the earth was happening in a very interesting way there, and a lot of things clicked, which is that the volcanoes on the island are producing the surface through which the culture is living on top of and responding to. And in particular, there was this one really interesting example of an eruption in 1783, which was from a volcano named Laki, that erupted for 8 months and changed the climate on the planet, and froze the Mississippi River at New Orleans. And in Europe, it caused the famine that was a contributing factor to instigating the French Revolution. And a lot of the language of that revolution comes from the natural history sort of phenomena of the volcano, like eruption. So in regards to the surface, that was such a crystalline example of how changes on the surface, or a process, or a culture of a process, create culture. And then the value of looking at a process like that and borrowing its language to sort of revolutionize a mental framework. It's sort of a sidestep answer, but that, to me, I was like, that is the surface. That's the depth that's coming.
And you bring the Thames into it, which is this kind of dirty river that's going through a city that has another kind of history, both visual and historically.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important that it's an urban river, and there's lots of conversations about what type of water is not in the work, like pond water, which is perfectly, symmetrical, or lake water, or even seawater. There's something very particular about rivers, and of course there's a literary tradition that, is massive.
Sadly,
thank you both. How many?
Oh, I was just saying, sadly, we don't have time for Q&A, but also wanted to. But good news is that you can ask the great panelists questions during lunch, and Tirza has a couple announcements and a special guest announcement from Juvenal. So let's thank our panelists for the morning.